You know what? I believe I've failed. I've tried since 2011 to prevent a big war. I've tried to prevent a war from breaking out because of the Cuban involvement in Venezuela and in other countries in Latin America. The Castro communists are infiltrating. They've infiltrated Venezuela and taken control over that country. It's Cuban Secret Service agents from the G2, their equivalent of the Gestapo, that are effectively running Venezuela. And I helped creating an organization called Operación Libertad Venezuela, Operation Freedom Venezuela, to try to unite the different people who are clear about what's going on, the resistance, let's call it, to try to unite them to become effective, because what's happening there is in some ways, not always, but in some ways similar to what happened in Nazi Germany. There was resistance in Nazi Germany too, but they were divided and ineffective. And that's the same thing that I saw happening in Venezuela. There were too often members of the resistance attack each other, attack other members, rather than uniting and attacking the regime and waging an effective campaign to overthrow the foreign dictatorship that is now controlling Venezuela. Venezuela was obviously the source of money. Cuba doesn't have any resources. So Venezuela, as an oil nation, having the biggest oil reserves in the world, was a logical target for Cuba to take to get the funds they needed with which to bribe other countries, bribe other presidents, and install, using election fraud, install their regimes. A combination of populism, demagoguery. Cubans have developed quite well social sciences in order to manipulate populations and use demagoguery to take power. It's a modern reincarnation of the ancient Greek method of using demagoguery to take power in a democracy and appeal to the lowest class of society, those that Karl Marx called Lumpenproletariat, and appeal to those groups in order to base the election victory on that. And then, once in power, they use election fraud to hold on to power. So it's like a scheme they have repeated in various countries. Get to power with populism and demagoguery, using the modern media. When Hitler came to power, he used demagoguery and he had access to radio. Today, they have access to TV. Like when they took power in Venezuela in 1990s, they had TV. Now internet has come, but I believe that they are still not dominating on internet. Internet is not their stronghold. It's still radio and TV. So anyway, once in power, they do a constitutional change in order to modify the constitution so that they can hold on to power and get past this problem of separation of powers, monopolize the power in the hands of the president, and install an election system that they can control in order to hold on to power. And then, well, the constitutional change is necessary in many countries because there was a term limit for how long the president will sit. So they had to change that. When they tried to change that in Honduras in 2009, they ran into a little problem because the Honduran constitution explicitly forbids that. It's so explicit that it's forbidden even to suggest changing it, even to talk about changing it. So that constitution was written when they went back to democracy from the military dictatorship in 1982 to prevent that somebody tried to perpetuate themselves in power. So the Honduran constitution is perhaps the most extreme in the world when it comes to forbidding explicitly changing that. It's one of those articles, the 5 articles cut in stone in their constitution. So when Manuel Zelaya tried to change that, all the other institutions of government protested, civil society protested, everybody protested, and the Supreme Court forbade Zelaya from pursuing what he was doing. He wanted to hold a referendum asking whether people wanted to create the Constitutional Assembly to rewrite the Constitution, and the Supreme Court declared that referendum unconstitutional and forbade everybody from participating in it. So when Zelaya pursued that, the what's it called, the chief prosecutor, whatever that is called in English, depending on the country, went to the Supreme Court and asked for an arrest warrant for the president for violating the Supreme Court prohibition against pursuing the referendum. And the Supreme Court issued that arrest warrant and issued it to the military, considering that it was the only force that was trustworthy and strong enough to be able to enforce it. So the military arrested Zelaya on the morning of the day the referendum was going to be held. The military had already refused to participate in it, which is why I guess they got the task to arrest him, because the Supreme Court knew that they were trustworthy. But then, when this happened, the Venezuelan international TV channel Telesur went out saying that this was a coup d'etat, a military coup d'etat. Now we have to know one thing, the whole world bought this. In fact, most of the world still believes it was a military coup d'etat, even though all the studies, all the legal studies that have been made of this action, like from the US Library of Congress, have concluded that it was constitutional. And when they were asked to revise it and revisit the study, they did, and they came to the same conclusion, that they had come to the right conclusion the first time. It was constitutional to depose Zelaya. So in Honduras, that plan failed because of their very, very strong constitutional prohibition against changing the term limits. But in other countries like Ecuador, Bolivia, they've done it, and they're trying to do it in more countries. Argentina is one of those. So there is a plan. This is the organization behind this, the union, the group behind this is Foro de Sao Paulo. That's the collaboration organization for implementing these changes in Latin America and making for Cuba to take control over Latin America. And since Venezuela was the key in all of this, as being the funding source, I went in and took contacts with those who are against the regime in Venezuela, the resistance, not the political opposition, because this was about liberty and sovereignty and not about politics, right versus left or anything like that. As a foreigner, I have no opinion about the political decisions of another country, obviously, but I can have an opinion about human rights, and this was about human rights, and still is. So I've been helping them for years, and I've seen up close what's happening. And I've done this because I fear that this is going to escalate into the Third World War. And all the time, we've just gotten closer and closer, and more things in the world have seemed to fall into place towards the Third World War, including, well, we got the Arab Spring that started, and the civil war in Libya, and then in Syria. Now we see in Syria how Russians are going in there fighting to defend Assad. Obviously, Telesur, apart from defending Zelaya and Honduras, they also defended Gaddafi in Libya, and they now defend Assad in Syria. Telesur that's the brainchild of Fidel Castro. It's not an international neutral TV news broadcast network like Al Jazeera or CNN. It's a propaganda network, the idea of which comes from Fidel Castro at a meeting in La Habana, Cuba in October, November, I think it was, I may be wrong about the month, in the year 2000. So now we are in October 2015, and we have all the evidence we need for that the elections in Venezuela are totally fraudulent. They're not free because they inhabilitate some candidates. So first of all, they're not free. Second of all, they're not just because there is election fraud, electronic election fraud, and they have a parallel computing system. They can enter whatever results they want, and according to inside sources, 40% of the registered voters are fake. They are ghosts, so they can put those votes where they want, and they put election centers on the evening of the election day, not the eve, but the evening of the same election day. They can create new election centers in places where nobody can see them, and put those votes from the ghost voters to change the outcome and get exactly the result they want. They have in the room where they do where all the data comes in from the election, they have two computers parallel. One that receives the results, and the other one where they put on the data they want, and then they can send data back out to the Smartmatic voting machines all over the country, and change the memory inside the voting machines in the polling places while the voting is still going on. And that's how they can get the result they want. Now, there is a parliamentary election on December 6th this year, and many believe, and I believe, that they are going to give a Pyrrhic victory to the opposition because they don't want a rebellion. They don't care if they don't win because the elections are not decisive. For elections to be genuine, they have to be free, fair, and decisive. And these elections are neither free, nor fair, nor decisive because there is no separation of powers. And Cuba is controlling Venezuela, so it doesn't really matter who is sitting in the national parliament, Asamblea Nacional. And what many believe is that they will give a small victory, Pyrrhic victory, to the opposition in order for the opposition to have some seats and to tell people, we won, go back home, don't protest, and we will, from the National Assembly, we will call for a recall election of the president, and that way we will liberate the country. Thus ignoring the fact that the regime can steal the recall election any which way they want, because the opposition doesn't want people to know that the regime controls the election results the way they want to. It's like they're closing their eyes, and the opposition really seems to be collaborating with the dictatorship here. And now we had Manuel Rosales coming back. He was the candidate for president of the opposition in 2006. A friend of mine, may rest in peace, Eric Ekvall, he was in the campaign of Manuel Rosales, and he told me how Rosales really had, he was like 50-50. He had a chance, a real chance to win, but he didn't want to acknowledge that. He was not really fighting to win. And when he lost, he left the country. They accused him of something. He left the country, he got a whole lot of money, he lived well overseas. And now he came back. Nobody understands really why he came back the other day. Immediately got arrested and put in jail. There were rumors already before he came back, before he said he would come back, there were already rumors on the internet that there was a deal made between him and the regime that he would come back and they would make some game, and that way make it seem like he was the leader of the opposition again, and that way have another fake opposition leader. So I believe, get to the point, I believe that this will only end with an open confrontation like in Libya and Syria. The regime is not going to let go of power, and they are protected by the Russians and the Cubans, and they are not going to let go of power without a military fight. And the Venezuelan people know that, and they are prepared to take that fight. So unfortunately, I have to acknowledge that I failed after years of trying to prevent the war. I don't think I managed to prevent the war. I believe there will be a war.